G'day everyone, this is Travis. Welcome to the first proper episode of this season. First thing I'd like to say is sorry for the audio quality. I'm having to record this in a not an ideal location, but please be advised that the audio quality will only increase from here. The second thing is I'm doing this interview with a veteran, with somebody that is very hard to interview because that person is me. I'm going to interview myself so that other veterans can see the format of the podcast and then make a decision about whether they want to be on it or not. Hopefully this is also helpful for my own mental health journey, because I'm not the perfect person to interview for this podcast because I don't think that I transitioned well. So let's talk about me. G'day Travis, this is Travis. Welcome to the podcast. No, I don't think I need to do that. So my first question for myself, and I've written a bunch of them down to try and make this easier to have a conversation without me rambling. The question I've got, number one, is were you able to start preparing for separation long enough before it happened? I would have to say that, was I able to? Yes. Did I? Absolutely not. I got out in the mid-2000s, before things like the Soldier Recovery Centre existed. So essentially I went on convalescence leave, and once a week I'd report to make sure that I hadn't harmed myself, and I saw the army doctor, and then I'd proceed on convalescence leave again. I did that for a number of months. Whilst it was great to have the opportunity to not live the army life while still being paid for the army, I didn't take that time to work on the next part of my journey. It wasn't until the last 2 or 3 weeks of that convalescence that the psychiatrist and I came to the decision that I needed to be on the outside. The army had decided that already, but I didn't have that in my mind. So in terms of a lot of that time was totally wasted. The only thing that I really did in that time was make sure that all the RPL things that I could do were up to date. So I had a few certificate 2s and 3s in various things, and the only one I ever used once I got out of the army was a Cert 4 in training and assessment. Did I do a resettlement seminar? No, I didn't. I didn't engage at all in any of that discharge process. Right up until the day of discharge, when I handed my ID card in, I don't think I did nearly enough or anything to really prepare myself for life outside in the civilian world. The next question is, what was the best thing you had to access to prepare yourself for discharge? Tying into Greenslopes Private Hospital, I was able to go there and do their PTSD program, and there I met some veterans that lived in the area that I was discharging into, and I was able to make some connections to the local community. I lived in Hervey Bay for about 10 years after discharge, and I wouldn't say I had more than 5 people that I would call my friends in that time. I didn't take time to engage in community activities. I was pretty much housebound. So once I got past that phase of my life where I felt sorry for myself and drank a lot, I then started to access things to prepare me for interacting with the world again. The next question on the list is, did you stop self-identifying as a retired soldier? For probably 15 years after I discharged, people say, what do you do? And I would say, I'm a retired soldier. Because subconsciously, that was who I identified with. I was a soldier that was retired. There was nothing else in life for me at that point. I also used to say we when I talked about the army, as if it was still an intrinsic part of me. And once I got to a point where I didn't say I'm a retired soldier, and when I said the army instead of we, I found that I was much better prepared for interacting with the civilian world, because I'd made that shift in my mind that it wasn't part of me and I wasn't part of it anymore. Next question is, how did you find leaving the tribe? A lot of people will say brotherhood or other words, but there is a very tribal nature to being in defence. And I found that the second that I wasn't at the tip of the spear, as you will, that my tribe was no longer accessible. All the people that were my closest friends were all doing something else. And that was normal in the military, because people didn't want you interacting with those people around you that weren't well. And I hope that's something defence has changed. But I searched in other activities and other groups for that same brotherhood. I found it again now in a very different way, but it was very hard for me to leave that environment and try and integrate in a society where the people around you don't have to trust intrinsically for your life. There are people that won't do the right thing beside you. The next question I've written for myself is, do you pine or mourn for those days? There was a great period in my life where I did pine for those days. I can certainly look back fondly on them, but I don't pine for them anymore. There's much more in my life now than there was back then. Yes, I still have trouble and strife, but it's a phase of my life that I've moved on from. There are people that I miss, but I don't miss the army itself, if that makes sense. The next question is, what was the hardest part to rejoining society? I think the hardest part was me. I didn't actually want to be a functioning member of society the way that others do. I wanted to lock myself away in a room and stick my head in the sand, if you will. So the hardest part for me was the social activities, because within defence at that time there was a structured way that you did things socially, and integrating into a civilian world where I thought that everyone was soft and easily offended and so on and so forth, all of that was actually me behaving inappropriately. Some of the dark humour and things that veterans use to survive in a very terrible environment at times is not appropriate for a civilised world. It's not appropriate for the normal world. So once I learned how to do that, I was able to reintegrate with people around me who weren't ex-service, weren't veterans, had no exposure to the military, and share common things with them. In terms of common things, I'm talking about passions, hobbies, sports. They're all things that I had in defence that I still had, and I was reluctant to share those with new people. But I started camping and four-wheel driving and doing things with a group online, and I think that was some of the best medicine that I had, was camping with other people. So we talked about the harder stuff. The next question I've got for myself is, what was the easiest part to rejoining society? I don't know that there was something that was easy for me to do. There are things that should have been easy that I self-sabotaged. So if I had have done more preparation and engaged fully with the discharge process, I think it would have been easier to rejoin society. Instead, I expected society to conform to my own ideas. But for myself is, did you have an epiphany at some point? I did some time as an instructor in cadets and was fairly well regarded there, until one day I did something that was fairly risky and a little bit silly when looking after other people's kids. And it was after I did that that I realised that my risk-taking was still a massive part of who I was. So when I had the epiphany that I needed to stop taking risks to feed myself adrenaline, that's when I started to make some real changes to who I was and what I did. Next question I've got is, what did you do to control your destiny? Well, for quite a while I didn't. I sat around and felt sorry for myself. But the best thing that I did to control my destiny is engage with my mental health team. My psychiatrist, my psychologist, a social worker, and learn how to talk to my partner and how to interact with the civilian world in a healthier way. What I did next was create some passive income, some entrepreneurial stuff to keep my mind busy. And I found I was able to do that, as well as titrate the amount of time that I had to spend on both work and pleasure, because I can be all or none. I can be very bipolar in terms of my activities. So controlling that bipolar style of thinking was key to me controlling my destiny. Kylie used to say that I always had a project and I'd be go at that project, and then I'd turn it off and the next project would start and I'd leave that entire project behind. Once I've learned to change that into a much more moderate pace, if you think of it like running, instead of doing a beep test, I was doing a 5k run. So I paced myself and learnt to chart the course for a longer term. This question is probably my favourite one, and it's the one that sort of surprised me the most. And that is, what skills did you not realise that defence gave you that have served you surprisingly well? I left defence as a corporal. I didn't realise that I had certain leadership skills and the ability to lead people fairly naturally in some situations. The ability to do human resources type work, the ability to keep people focused on tasks, the ability to get across a clear plan for what I wanted. They're things that are not really prevalent in most of the civilian organisations that I've been involved with since, and I've found that people will come to me and ask me a lot of questions about, should I do this or should I do that, since I left defence. So the mentoring role that I learnt as a recruit instructor, that I don't think every recruit instructor necessarily learns how to mentor, but as a junior NCO I certainly learnt how to do that very well. And I had no idea that people would call on me for years after about how to do things and how not. I still occasionally receive calls from people that I served with or people that I've met through time. They'll call me and say, hey, do you know anything about this? And normally they're asking me about something I do know about. So it brings me great pleasure to be able to help those people with whatever it is that they can do. And that's skills that I learnt within defence. So we've gone from my favourite question to the question I'm going to like the least, and that is, do you still struggle with physical or mental health? Absolutely. I'm actually recording this while I'm seeing my mental health team for support. The other thing that I've struggled with is my weight. I have let my weight balloon out of control. I'm doing something more active about that right now, but the amount of weight that I've put on is ridiculous. Some of that is rebelling against the exercise that we did in the military and the scheduled and natured, the way that PT is done. You get ordered to do it. Before I joined the military, I self-motivated and ran and jogged and did all that stuff. Yes, some of that is harder to do after you've got injuries, but the only one stopping me from going walking right now is me, and it has been for the last 10 years. Am I better at that now? Yes. Do I need to be more? Absolutely. And I also need to be more engaged with my mental health team so that I can even out the bumps in the ups and downs of life and not get to that soldier on point that a lot of soldiers do until you break. What is the average day for you is a very interesting question. I get up on time. I show up and I do volunteer work where I can, and I talk to the team of people that run a business for me about what they need to do to get their jobs done. I'm fairly active mentally in that. I'm not physically active in how that business is run. I let others do that, and I find that's the best way to do things, is to find people that are specialists, that are good at what they do, and let them do their jobs. It's something that I'm learning more and more to do, is to let the people below you do their jobs. But it's a job that not a lot of leaders do very well. So after that, generally I'll have lunch with the team, and I'll do various things around the facility that I manage for Wounded Heroes, until 4 or 5 o'clock, and I'm actually knocking off now, which is something that I wouldn't normally do. I would normally stay in the office or stay on a job or work with people until it's almost time to go to bed, but I'm actually learning to stop at 4 o'clock and go back to my room and do self-care tasks, and that includes doing my own washing, doing my own cooking, doing those sort of things, instead of leaning on takeaway food and stuff like that. I'm getting to bed at a reasonable time, and I'm trying to get in at least 30 minutes of activity throughout that day where I go for a decent walk. Where I live, there's 33 acres of bushland and grass, so it's very easy to go out and watch the roos and pat the horses and do a bunch of stuff that's not really work, that keeps me fairly active. What I tend to do at night is interact on Discord or through gaming, so that I can have a different social outlet and talk to a different bunch of people. I'm finding that very cathartic. The next question probably isn't for me, but it's for those people that I think did this question very well, and that's, why do you think you did well at the transition? So I'm going to make this a bit rhetorical, and I'm going to indicate that the people that I talk to might have one thing that they did very different to me, and I hope they're able to speak well about something different they did to what I've done in my journey that helped them, and then in turn that can help you. The next question is very interesting, and I've changed my mind on that in the last couple of years, especially because I physically couldn't fit in a uniform anymore because I'm massively overweight. But the question is, if you could put a uniform back on tomorrow at rank and seniority, would you? And I would have to say a resounding no. Years ago I would have said, yeah, I'd go back in at the drop of a hat. But I would have to say no now, because in the 15 odd years since I discharged, the military has changed significantly what it does, and I wouldn't adapt to the new environment. I would like to live in the old days, if you would, the glory days in my own mind, and I don't think I could live in that structured environment now that I've been out of it for so long. Ironically, some of my behaviours are still very military, but I have no need or want to join the army again. Next question is, what is the highlight of your post-separation career? There's been a few. I did work briefly in tourism, and I found great joy in taking people to some of the most remote places in Australia, places where you're 6 or 7 days from help, and the Canning Stock route is absolutely one of those for me. It is an absolute highlight in my memories. The next is putting on the first employee in what my business that started off as a side hustle was. When I put on the first full-time staff member, that was a real stepping point in my life. There's a bunch of other stuff I'm really proud of in my post-discharge world, and I don't want to talk about a lot of them simply because they relate to people, and I want to keep that as a private matter. We're getting towards the end, but the third last question is, do you consider yourself an entrepreneur? It's an interesting word. I'd like to say that I like the idea of starting and running businesses, but what I like is the activity, the thought process, the engagement that your brain has to have to think about new stuff. I'm not doing anything new. I'm not recreating the wheel. I haven't found a product that no one else has made. I'm just selling stuff that everyone else sells and doing it my way. So in those terms, I wouldn't call myself an entrepreneur because I'm not doing something new. I'm just doing retail, if you will. It did start as my side hustle. That's my second last question. Do you have a side hustle? And I would encourage every veteran of military and any other public service world, get yourself a side hustle. Sell a couple of things on eBay or Amazon. Doesn't matter what it is. You can throw $100 at Alibaba and buy some stuff and get it over here and put it online, and who cares if you don't do well? It's a little eBay shop. But if you do well, you never know. It could be the next phase of your life. The last question is, have you created other income streams? And I didn't necessarily do this well or intently, but yes, I have. I had a house. I moved out of that house and I rented that to other people. So that was an income stream. And I've also got some other online businesses. I sell a few ebooks and a few fact sheets and a few things like that, and that just ticks away in the background and creates money. I've done a little bit of work on Fiverr and Airtasker, doing voiceover work, doing consulting, stuff like that. I still get phone calls occasionally and do work for other people, so there's always a little bit of a side hustle in the background in that regard. I would highly recommend anyone that has been put off work that they try and find a side hustle that becomes a passive income stream. And the passivity is really the key to it. It needs to be something where you don't have to do anything except check up on it for 20 to 30 minutes every couple of days. A lot of those can seem like get rich quick streams, but once you get into them, you realise that they're not. They're get rich slow schemes, and that's what people need to be involved in. So they're the questions that I had for myself. This one's going to be obviously a short one because it's not a two-way conversation. It's not two people bouncing off each other and reflecting on what the last question was. I'm not going to do a structured question and answer type interview series. I'm going to create conversations. Anyone that's listened to my other podcast knows that I started very robotically and it became fairly unstructured in the last bit. But I think that people enjoy hearing a conversation more than they do hearing an interview. So if you'd like to be part of this, you can email me, and the email is in the show notes. If you'd like to support what I do, I'd love for you to join me on Patreon, and again, the details are in the show notes. I've been Travis, and this has been the Transition Podcast. This show is brought to you by the people that support me on Patreon. If you'd like to jump over there, give me $1 a month to run this show, I'd really appreciate it. If you'd like to give more, there's some sweet merch you can get through Patreon, and I'd love you to get a sticker, a mug, a t-shirt, whatever it is that you can do to support my podcast.